Hi and welcome back to our series of lessons that we've been looking at on an Inspector Calls. Thank you very much again for everyone who's been commenting and sharing ideas, especially through Google Classroom and through email. The first few essay plans from the Mr. Birling lesson a few days ago are starting to come through now, which is great. So if there's anything at all that people would like me to mark, please just get in touch and I'll have a look at that for you. What we're going to do today, we're going to have a look at the last of the Birling family. We're going to have a look at Eric, the character who has the final interrogation before the inspector leaves, and arguably is the most criminal in his activities, has the most despicable behaviour before the inspector arrives, but arguably could also be considered one of the characters who is the most redeemable, one of the characters who shows remorse for his actions, and actually one of the biggest changes throughout the play. Okay, so let's start with Eric. Eric in himself is a bit of a contradiction. Within Priestley's initial stage directions, he's described as half shy and half assertive. So what we've got here is a juxtaposition between a character who isn't quite sure of himself, who isn't really sure of his place in the world. By saying that he's half shy, we've got this person who is nervous, who doesn't know quite where he fits yet, who can be quite silly and quite immature, but at the same time we have this idea of assertiveness, someone who can assert their power and their dominance. Eric is a upper class, certainly middle to upper class, young man who has all the privileges that his father has earned through being part of that social status. So Eric has that assertion because he understands that and he can use that power. However, his growing maturity is being contradicted by the silliness in his behaviour. Priestley's big idea with Eric is quite similar to that which he uses the character of Gerald, in that he's critiquing the way that young men, particularly young men from the upper classes, can behave, and again particularly towards women from the lower social status. Within these two characters, what we see is young men behaving fairly despicably towards women, treating women like property and utilise ownership through their commercial and social status. What we also have with Eric is Priestley critiquing, but also quite gently critiquing, the youth and the immaturity of youth, and the fact that these aren't the actions have consequences, much in the same way that he is critiquing with Sheila. However, he also has this sense of optimism with Eric, the fact that he's someone who might be able to change, whose perspectives and values of life are learned through experience. Ultimately, Eric's experience is through a horrible situation, and he learns a very, very harsh lesson, but he has that capacity to change in his behaviour. So Priestley's big ideas essentially are looking at the idea of gender roles, they're looking at the idea of social status, and also looking at the idea of age against youthful innocence and youthful growing maturity. From the very beginning of the play, we get a sense of Eric's immaturity and his role as someone who is not quite fully aware of social conventions, someone who is not quite a full mature character as yet. So at the very start of the play, at the celebratory dinner, Sheila describes him as SQUIFFY, which is quite an interesting phrase to use, and Mrs. Birling even responds to the language that you girls use nowadays. However, it's important to make that point that he is drinking too much at the very start of the play, starting to lose control. When Sheila is speaking, he feels that he suddenly had to laugh and he bursts into like a guffaw. So it's showing his lack of maturity, his lack of social awareness at that point. Several times throughout the play, his father describes him as spoilt, as if he's had every single privilege handed to him on a silver spoon and he's never had to work for anything really in his life. His father also describes his varsity ways, which is a fancy way of describing his university education, an education that hasn't seemed to really expose Eric to the real world. His father is quite often telling him to be quiet, Eric, and just listen. These imperative phrases showing the control over Eric and showing that his father certainly doesn't seem as mature. When Gerald is talking about how he was left to look after the works, Mr. Birling expresses surprise that his father would let him do that, because his lack of trust in Eric puts him in that position. The relationship between Eric and his father is one of the most interesting ones within the play. As we've already discussed in that previous section, we have Mr. Birling quite often trying to control Eric, telling him to be quiet, and when Eric looks like he's about to reveal something a bit too much to the inspector, Mr. Birling does interject and tells him to be quiet. At the very start of the play, Mr. Birling describes Gerald as just the sort of son-in-law I've always wanted. If we read in the subtext, just the sort of son that he'd always wanted. It shows that he doesn't really have that respect for Eric, doesn't really have the belief in him, if you like. As the play reaches its conclusion, Mr. Birling describes Eric as a hysterical young fool. Why didn't you turn to me? Why didn't you come to me when you found yourself in trouble? And Eric has a really important line for us to remember, which is, you're not the sort of father a chap can turn to when he's in trouble. A really, really useful line to explore with their relationship, looking at the fact that the relationship goes both ways. Mr. Birling doesn't trust Eric in the same way. Because of that, Eric doesn't trust his father. He doesn't feel that he can go to him for advice and for support, and can't rely on him to help him out, and this leads him down this criminal path, if you like. Obviously Eric isn't a totally innocent character in this part. He does drink too much, and he is a character who makes his own decisions. However, by having this complicated, complex, inferior relationship with his father, where he sees himself as lesser and never going to be able to match his father's achievements, it does make his behaviour a little bit more understandable. One of the most important ways to read the character of Eric, or to investigate the character of Eric, is to look at his relationship with women, and to look in particular at his relationship with Eva Smith. It's quite an interesting parallel that we can draw between the way that Eric behaves with Eva and the way that Gerald behaved with her. With Gerald, we do have some sort of romantic intention, we do have some sort of ideas of him being that wonderful fairy prince and supportive, and a lot more romantic in his attentions. Even if he doesn't use, he has no intention of marrying Daisy Renton or anything along those lines, he treats her kindly. However, when we hear Eric's story and we hear about how Eric behaved, it is very dark, and it is very, very much a story of superiority, and he's using Eva Smith. He describes the fact that his behaviour was hellish. I can't even remember, that's the hellish thing. He also uses the phrase, I was in the sort of state when a chap easily turns nasty. It's quite interesting to read these phrases, because at some point Eric is trying to euphemise what he's saying, he's trying to downplay what he's done. However, he also is quite frank about this. At one point, when discussing marriage, he says, I wasn't in love with her or anything like that, but she was pretty and a good sport. Again, looking at his immaturity in the way that he's treating her. The inspector probably has the most important line along this route when he describes her, how you treated her like an animal. It's quite telling how Eric responds to this. He's very ashamed of his behaviour and the way that he acted. One of Eric's redeeming qualities is his capacity to change, and as the play continues and it reaches its conclusion, Eric demonstrates his want and his desire to accept responsibility for what he's done and to actually face the consequences. His father is, as soon as the inspector leaves, the first thing he says to Eric is, "You're the one I blame for this." and the fact that he's going to be facing criminal prosecution because he's stolen money. He's the only character who's actually done anything that is criminal rather than scandalous. Eric says, I don't care anymore. And if he feels that if he's going to go to prison, that is what he deserves. He's reflecting on his behaviour and he feels that he's responsible. He confronts his mother. He tells her that she didn't even try to understand what was going on with Eva Smith. And Mrs. Birling telling him, I didn't know, isn't acceptable as an excuse to Eric anymore. Eric's also greatly influenced by the words of the inspector. He confronts his father and says, remember when you were telling us about having to look after our own in the world and ourselves, and then one of those cranks walks in, the inspector. The inspector has a profound effect upon Eric, and Eric is forced to reflect about his behaviour and the changes that he wants to make. He makes a purposeful statement that he will never forget how he's been made to feel and the actions and how his behaviour has consequences for other people. Eric's an interesting character to portray on stage. As we've discussed with previous characters such as Gerald and Mr. Birling, wearing of the black dinner suits can be significant, as it could be seen that his moral darkness is being explored through his use of codes of clothing. Likewise, the way that he operates around the dinner table is quite significant. At the start of the dining, the characters are almost paired with each other, with Mr. and Mrs. Birling at the head of the table and Gerald and Sheila paired with each other. Eric is isolated, he's alone, which could signify this idea of him feeling half shy, half assertive. He's not quite sure about where he fits yet, and he's someone who's isolated in the world. There are subtle foreshadowings in the opening sequences of the play where they were described, things where Gerald describes what Eric says as slightly fishy to me, and Eric has a phrase where he talks about there was a girl and then stops. He doesn't reveal the full extent of that situation. So it's foreshadowing what's going to be going on in the play. Likewise, the way that he operates and makes his own drink with a steady hand tells us this is someone who's familiar with alcohol, someone who has had experience and knows more about the alcohol than he might be letting on to the rest of the family. Okay, I hope that's been a really useful run through about the character of Eric. He's one of the richest characters to get a lot of information from, a lot of different ways and different threads in which you can take this. To follow is the same as the previous few videos, where there's a couple of questions just to get us thinking about his character, his basic characteristics, and then a few more, a bit more moralistic debate ones looking at how guilty we feel Eric is, or whether we think he is forgivable at all from his behaviour. Like I said, the first few of these essay plans and essays have started to come through now, so as you're going through these, obviously save them for your own files and save them for your own revision notes, but if you'd like me to have a look at them, then please pass them on. And I'll just stay tuned at the end for our film recommendation for the day. Film recommendation today, I've gone for one of my all-time favourites, and something that I vividly remember the promotion and the marketing running up to this film actually taking place. I remember getting a CD-ROM, of the trailer and playing it almost constantly on repeat. Going to the cinema at 9 AM in the morning and booking my ticket for the evening and arriving 2 hours early to make sure that we were there first and just to be able to see through it, and that is The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring. Unfortunately, with the ticket, we were seated right into the speaker, so the first time the Nazgul appear, the Black Riders, and screeching, jumped out of my skin. But this film, I remember being the first time I saw something, I thought, this is absolutely incredible. There's some fantastic sequences in the mines, and the final sequence, the battle by the river, is absolutely epic. So I would check it out. And it is 3 hours, so it will kill quite a lot of time. Until next time, where we're going to have a look at the inspector. I hope we all stay safe, and I hope we're finding these really, really useful. And I'm quite enjoying doing them actually. So thank you for all the lovely comments, and if you'd like to subscribe, that would be really, really helpful as well. Okay.